Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Cuba welcomes a new president, Miguel Diaz-Canel. Will Cuba's first non-Castro president in 60 years steer the nation in a new direction? And the U.S. bans American companies from selling to ZTE, the Chinese company. Is this just an opening round in a larger trade war? You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin our show today in Cuba, where the first Vice President, Miguel Diaz-Canel, has become the country's first non-Castro leader since the year 1959 revolution. Diaz-Canel was the only name put forward for president in this election. His presidency marks a historic handover, ending 6 decades of rule by the Castro brothers. Take a look at this first.
A significant generational change. 57-year-old Miguel Diaz-Canel is set to replace 86-year-old Raul Castro as president of Cuba. The position of president, along with 30 other members of the inner cabinet, must be ratified by a secret ballot of the 605 deputies who make up the National Assembly.
This means a continuation of going forward. Fidel gave Cubans the strength to keep pushing forward at any cost. With Raul and now a younger president, youth imposes itself. We must keep going forward.
Diaz-Canel is an electrical engineer by training who rose through the ranks of the Communist Party of Cuba. He is seen by some as a liberal, supporting gay rights, greater internet access, and a more open press. And he is going to be the first Cuban leader who is not part of the historic generation. Cuba's former leader Fidel Castro ruled the island for almost 50 years. He stepped down, passing the presidency on to his younger brother, Raul Castro. During Raul Castro's 10-year term, he committed to push forward nationwide reforms.
I think that Raul Castro's main legacy, one of the main legacies, is being to make reforms a legitimate policy, to make Cubans used to the idea that socialism is not a system that is intact, that is the same.
But there are still plenty of challenges. The economy is struggling, the market reforms have stalled, and détente with the United States has gone backwards under President Donald Trump. The new president faces the daunting task of turning Cuba's economy around and adopting more reforms.
For more discussion on Cuba's new leader, the first time in 60 years who is not a Castro, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Mr. Jiang Xueshi, Vice President of the Chinese Association Latin American Studies from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Also joining us in Havana, we have Carlos Alzugari, who is a professor of international relations from the University of Harare, and also he is a former Cuban ambassador to Brussels. In Washington, D.C., we have Fernando Menendez, who is a senior fellow for strategic initiatives at the Center for a Secure Free Society. Gentlemen, I want to welcome to the three of you. First of all, Ambassador Alzugari, I need to go to you. What do you make of the significance that this time, 60 years, non-Castro become president of Cuba at this critical juncture?
Well, this is something that would have happened anyway. But I think what is significant is that since Raul Castro took power in 2006, he announced later in his period that he will have 2 terms and that he will retire and that a new generation of leaders will take place. I think what Raul has done in the meantime is first rescue the decision-making process that will mean that Cuba can be ruled in a collective way. For example, he reestablished the party congresses. No party congresses had been taken place in 12 years. After he took power, 3 party congresses are going to, before he's done 3 party congresses. And he has emphasized institution building. At the same time, he has called on this generation. This is a generation of people who are a result of the revolution. These are people who have been born at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. and they lived under a socialist system that worked, although it was subsidized by the Soviet Union, but also they have lived embargoed. They have been born and raised embargoed by the United States.
All right.
So their position towards the United States, you might think that they will be very skeptical and very hardline with the United States.
All right, we're going to have you, Mr. Ambassador, explain in detail some of the other things. But let me go to you, Mr. Menendez. You are based in the United States. I wonder if you have different views about this rising generation of leaders in their late 50s and 60s, like the current president right now in Cuba. How much space does he have in exploring different ways of governance and also reforms?
I think what we're watching is a revolution that started once very radically, but has become fundamentally a conservative revolution. This is a transition within the forms of conservatism. I listened to Mr. Diaz-Canel's speech just a few moments ago, and he emphasized that there will be no change. He emphasized that there will be continuity. This was his primary focus, was on the continuity of things. I think this is a personnel change. As Ambassador Alzugaray mentioned, this was going to happen anyway. Time is taking its toll on the historic leaders of the revolution. They are dying. Just recently, Laszlo Hart, who was one of the key leaders of the Cuban Revolution, passed away at 87. Raul is 86. Machado Ventura, who is the second secretary of the party, is also in his 80s. So this was going to happen anyway. But there is no sign that there will be any kind of systemic change. And frankly, the fact that Mr. Diaz-Canel was the only candidate shows that there is no alternative and no discussion of alternatives within the Cuban system.
All right.
So again, I would say this is a very conservative revolution.
Well, this is a conservative revolution. That's probably the label you would like to put over there. But Mr. Jiang, from China's perspective, what do you make of this generational change? I mean, right now, Cubans are facing hard realities of its economy. Meanwhile, its regional issues is not being resolved with the United States at all.
Well, my answer to a question would be yes and no. By saying yes, there should be some kind of minor changes. Well, different person have different mentality, different policies. So I would say there should be some kind of changes. By saying no, well, as you know, Raul Castro is still the party chief.
That's right.
So she is still in power. So I would say the so-called post-Castro era is still there. If Raul Castro is no longer the party chief, then we are going to see the arrival of the post-Castro era. So because of this kind of reality, so I would say, well, the new leader might make some changes, but not in big changes.
Okay. Ambassador Alzugaray, it's important that we understand what is likely to driving the agenda of the current president once he comes into power. Of course, he did his inaugural speech. I mean, people use big words, and also they talk about politics in their inauguration speech. But what about the real policies likely for the future? Is it going to be driven, Ambassador Alzugaray, by ideology, or is it going to be driven by the economic realities and the emergency to change and reform? Or is it going to be driven by U.S.-Cuba relations, which of course has a lot of impact on the economy as well? Mr. Ambassador.
There is no escaping the economic reality. In the last session of the Central Committee plenum that took place in March, there was a self-criticism of the party about the economic process. Diaz-Canel himself has said that things have not turned out in the economy as they had expected. Now, focus a little bit on the guy who's going to be his first vice president, Mr. Valdez Mesa. Mr. Valdez Mesa comes from the labor movement. He is a pragmatist. Diaz-Canel is also a pragmatist. I don't believe that he's an ideologue. He showed a lot of pragmatism when he was first secretary of the party in Villa Clara. He showed a lot of pragmatism when he was in the Minister of Higher Education. So I believe that the reality, combined that with his open-mindedness, his career has not been marked with ideological positions, more with practical solutions to practical problems, linking to the people. So I think that will continue. Remember this, Cuba, there is an agenda of change that has not been completed under Raul Castro. So he has to complete that agenda of change, and then he has to look to the next party Congress in 2021, where decisions have to be made about who's going to replace Raul Castro. So I would say that reality will set in.
Right. Mr. Menendez, it is no secret that the reform plan adopted by the Cuban Communist Party and of course by the Cuban government has not finished and has not been fully implemented, as Ambassador El-Zagari just mentioned earlier. But there must be reasons to that. It was being slow, the reform process, as people these days talking about Raul Castro's reform efforts. So will Mr. Menendez, that the current president make a difference? What kind of political tools, what kind of pragmatism, what kinds of brotherhood does he have in hand in order to push that thing even faster than Raul Castro?
Well, I would say two things. First, the reforms that Raul Castro tried to implement over the last 10 years, even someone as knowledgeable as Peter Hakim from Inter-American Dialogue said, I believe on this program or some other program related to the network, that those reforms had failed. They had failed. And they are very minor, they're very slow, they're not fundamental to the functioning of the Cuban economy. And you have to ask yourself, someone like Raul Castro, with his legitimacy, with his power, and with his support base, was not able to make those reforms succeed. So the question then becomes, what is the power base for Mr. Diaz-Canel? He's not a member of the Cuban military that I'm aware of. He is being watched very closely by the older leaders who are still in a position. He said in his speech today that the current leader of the revolutionary process is and will continue to be Raul Castro. Right. He still believes in the single party and state ownership and central planning. So it is hard for one. I'm an economist and I would like to see the Cuban economy take off and move forward, but it hasn't done so in the last 10 years. With the full support of Raul Castro, I don't see how it will do so under Diaz-Canel.
Right. Let me ask Mr. Jiang from China. Mr. Jiang, we saw reform process in China, for example, which is also a socialist country, of course with Chinese characteristics, as China claimed, and also Vietnam, reform in the market, and some of the other countries as well. Will these be examples and models for Cuba? Will they work in the Cuban circumstance?
Well, first of all, we must notice that the Cuban people just want to see transformation and changes. But on the other hand, the Cuban leadership, well, is not so open, not so liberal. So I would say they need to learn from Deng Xiaoping. Don't care about the color of the cats if you can catch mice. So I would say that as a new leader should do something about this kind of learning process, learning by doing. I would say that in the long run, well, probably this Caribbean island might be China in the Caribbean.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, China, Caribbean, yes, but that will come not in the so-called near term. In the long run, I would say Cuba will march forward on the road of reform.
Okay.
And Cuba will be, just let me repeat, Cuba will be the China in the Caribbean.
Ambassador El-Zagari, I want you to briefly respond to that statement made by Mr. Jiang here from China.
I think I would like to respond to the other speaker. The problem with the reform process It's not a problem of design. The design is there, has been adopted. By the way, Diaz-Canel has been part of the decision-making process of the design. The problem with the reform is implementation, and the implementation is basically done by the Council of Ministers, not by anyone else. Now, Diaz-Canel will have a lot of leverage. One, granted, he doesn't have the charismatic leadership of Fidel or Raul, but he is very well known in the party. He has the support of the party people. He will have the support of the military because Raul will guarantee that to him. And then he will be the only, he and Valdez Mesa will be the only ones in the leadership who are members of the Politburo, President, Vice President of the Council of State, and President, Vice President of the Council of Ministers.
Right.
So he will have a lot of leverage to do what he thinks he's going to do.
All right, we hope that will be the case, but on the other hand, Mr. Menendez, here's the thing about Cuba and U.S. relations, and that is going to have a big impact on Cuba's economy, whether it is going to revive, as it hopes to be, whether reform will eventually really provide a lot of opportunities. From the Trump administration, a lot of things have changed, reverting of the early Obama administration policy toward Cuba. Even the travel ban now is back in place. So how much opportunity does Cuba really have if the Trump administration keep on pushing? And by the way, if the Trump administration keep on pushing, Cuba has to also react in a strong way, at least in rhetoric.
Well, I think, to be quite honest, I think that Cuba is not on the agenda of the United States at this moment. Whether it will be so in a few years' time, we will have to see. The United States right now seems focused on North Korea. It seems focused on places like Syria. Cuba is simply very, very, very low on the list of priorities of this administration. It was incumbent on the Cubans, for example, to take advantage of the 2 years they had under the Obama administration to forge stronger links and perhaps to open slightly more. I don't think that the changes, and this I think Ambassador Alzugaray might agree with me, I think that the changes that have to happen in Cuba have to be internal. And I think and believe strongly with Mr. Jiang that the changes will have to be much more profound than they have been. For example, at this moment, you can start a small business in Cuba, but you're not really allowed to accumulate capital. That is probably the one way that you're going to see economic growth taking place. But there is no protection of private property in Cuba, not truly protection. You're running these businesses by permission, not by rights. You're not allowed to accumulate capital in Cuba. These are things that are going to have to take place internally.
Okay.
They're going to have to come to terms as China came to term and say, look, the system that we have been operating under, it's not about fixing it, it's about changing it.
Well, Ambassador Alzugaray, what do you think? Will the U.S. relation with Cuba has a big impact on Cuba's future road of reform, and whether that reform will provide much fruit when it comes to economic growth?
Well, I agree with Mr. Menendez. The changes have to be done in Cuba. I think the Cuban leadership has to convince itself that the embargo is not going to be lifted anytime soon. It's irrelevant to discuss if they took advantage enough of the Obama opening. There can be a long argument. They would say that Obama didn't really open, and I would agree with that. For example, the travel ban doesn't exist anymore. Even Trump himself didn't change the regulations in a way that it will stop people from traveling. More impact had this so-called acoustic incident on travel. But I think we are going to have a very strong rhetoric, and the Cuban government is going to be very pragmatic, waiting for the moment when the Trump administration changes. It's going to change at some point in time. In the meantime, Cuba has to progress in the reform process. Now, every economist in Cuba agrees with what Mr. Menendez said. We have to have capital formation. We have to develop that. Now, the problem is that there has been resistance in certain parts of the party and in the Council of Ministers, the Council of State. One question here is, are these resistance are going to be still present in the next. We already know that at least one resistant is out, which is Mr. Machado Ventura. Now, we have to see how the Council of Ministers is going to be structured. Okay. I believe we're going to see a lot of young reformist heads in the Council of Ministers.
All right, before we go, also 20 seconds for you, Mr. Jiang, before we wrap it up.
Well, I would say if the Cuban people want to have a better life, two conditions. The government should take more bold measures on the road of reforms. And secondly, if this kind of reform wants to be successful, the U.S. should stop its embargo. Without these two conditions, well, the Cuban situation will continue to be not so good.
Jiang Shixue, Carlos Azugali, and Fernando Fernandez, thank you so much, gentlemen, for helping us to understand the very first day the new president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, comes into power. What is likely to be his future agenda and challenges? Thank you. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.